As passengers began filing onto the plane, the flight attendant kept her eyes moving over the crowd. Her routine was familiar by now, as she had done this thousands of times. But today, something felt different as her gaze settled on him. He stood apart from the others, a man alone with no companions. A few people near him glanced up, but his eyes were fixed straight ahead with an almost unnerving stillness. There was something about the way he carried himself that set him apart. His posture was too perfect, too controlled. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. But there was an energy around him that didn't sit right. It wasn't arrogance, but something else, like a quiet tension in the air that only she could feel. He wasn't dressed for the occasion. Most passengers wore comfortable clothing for a long-haul flight, but he stood in a crisp suit and a dark overcoat. His shoes shone too brightly, reflecting the harsh airport lights in a way that seemed out of place for a flight so late in the evening. She watched him as he walked down the jet bridge, his pace steady but unhurried, unlike the usual rush of people trying to find their seats. Quickly he moved with a strange sense of purpose, his face blank, his eyes never straying from the path ahead of him. The flight attendant had been working this route for over 10 years. She had seen all kinds of passengers. But something about this man made her feel uneasy. She followed him down the aisle as he entered the cabin, giving him a polite smile. But he didn't respond. He didn't even glance her way. His eyes remained fixed forward, as though he had somewhere else to be, and didn't care to acknowledge anyone around him. His lack of interaction wasn't alarming in itself. Some people simply preferred silence, but there was a subtle coldness about him that made her second-guess her instincts. She had seen passengers like this before, the kind who kept to themselves. But he was different. There was an aura around him, like he wasn't really here with them. It was as if he was playing a role. The flight attendant shook her head, mentally dismissing the feeling, and moved on to the next row. But her eyes kept returning to him. She didn't know why she couldn't pull herself away from watching him. It wasn't his clothes or his aloofness. It was something deeper, a sense of mystery that she couldn't quite understand. The plane took off without incident, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. The air around him felt too still, too controlled, too perfect. Even as the plane climbed higher, she could still feel his presence in the cabin. And every time she passed by his seat, she noticed his gaze didn't follow her movements. His eyes remained focused ahead, as though there was nothing in the world that could distract him from whatever thoughts he was lost in. She could almost hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, deep and controlled. But it wasn't enough to ease her worries. Every time her eyes met his, he held that same intense look, and for a brief moment she wondered if he was aware of how closely she was watching him. He must have noticed she was looking, but he never reacted. His face didn't betray a single emotion. She continued with her duties, checking on passengers and making sure everyone had what they needed. But her mind kept drifting back to him. It was like he was a puzzle she needed to solve, a riddle that kept lingering in the back of her mind. The flight began to settle into its rhythm, but for her, time moved slowly. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. Every time she glanced back toward his seat, he was still there, still watching straight ahead, like he had all the time in the world, and nothing could break his focus. No one else on the plane seemed to notice him, or if they did, they didn't think twice about it. But for the flight attendant, he was becoming an enigma she couldn't shake, and deep down she knew something wasn't right. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't ignore it either. Here was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. As the plane leveled out, cruising above the clouds, the hum of the engines became a constant background noise. But for the flight attendant, that noise seemed to fade into the distance. The cabin was filled with the usual sounds of passengers, settling in, some chatting quietly, others lost in their own worlds. But all the while she couldn't help but keep her eyes drifting back to him, the man who had stood out from the moment he boarded. She continued her rounds through the aisles, smiling at passengers, checking their needs. But her thoughts kept pulling her back to his seat. He hadn't moved since the plane took off, still sitting with perfect posture, his hands folded neatly on his lap. She had never seen anyone so still, so composed in the middle of a long flight. There was no tension in his posture, but also no relaxation. It was as though he had deliberately forced himself into a kind of stasis, something that made her wonder if he was controlling himself, or if something deeper was at play. She moved closer to his row now, with the intention of offering drinks to the other passengers, her steps light. As she neared his seat, she caught herself studying him again. His face was blank as always, but his eyes, those eyes seemed distant, like he wasn't really seeing anything around him. But looking through it into some faraway place, she almost felt like an intruder on his private world, like by approaching him she was disturbing something fragile. It was only when she reached his seat and spoke that his gaze finally shifted slowly toward her, his eyes locking with hers. And for just a moment she felt a chill run down her spine. His gaze wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was as though he had sized her up in the briefest of moments and found her unworthy of further attention. He blinked once, and his lips parted, barely a whisper escaping, as he gave his order, something vague about water, no ice. But even that seemed rehearsed, somehow not the request. But the way he said it, as though he had prepared for this very moment. Before stepping onto the plane, she handed him the drink, and noticed his fingers were longer than most men's, and strangely delicate, like someone who hadn't worked with their hands in years. But she didn't have time to dwell on that. Her instincts were still nagging at her, telling her something was off about this entire encounter. But she couldn't put her finger on it. As she turned away from his seat, she caught sight of a passenger in the row behind him. Glancing at her, she quickly looked away, pretending to focus on other passengers who were eager for attention. But her mind was still on the man in seat 15. What was he hiding? Why did he seem so detached, so controlled? She had seen her share of strange passengers. Before, some were simply introverts, others had social anxiety. But this was different. It was the feeling in the air around him, a sense of purpose, a quiet intensity, that she couldn't ignore. The rest of the cabin continued its usual rhythm. And as the flight moved on, she found herself moving past him again. But this time something felt even stranger. There was a slight shift in his posture, not much, but just enough for her to notice the stillness had broken for the briefest moment. His eyes shifted toward the window, as if scanning the view below the horizon. But the motion was so quick, so subtle, that no one else seemed to catch it. The flight attendant found herself thinking back to the first time she noticed him. As he boarded, his movements were deliberate. But now she began to wonder if something else was going on, if he was trying to hide something or someone. Maybe his behavior was calculated. Maybe this was all part of a larger plan. Or perhaps it was just her imagination running wild. But the nagging feeling in her gut told her that she was missing something important. She watched as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small notebook. He flipped through the pages, quickly, his eyes scanning the words with a focused intensity. She could no longer ignore. Her curiosity grew stronger than before. Was he a businessman, a secret agent, or someone else entirely? The thought lingered. As she continued her rounds, she couldn't shake the sense that this passenger was far more than he appeared to be. Something was brewing beneath the surface, something she needed to figure out. As the hours passed, the flight attendant could feel the weight of the mystery growing heavier on her shoulders. She moved through the cabin with the usual efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere. It kept circling back to him. The man in 15, who hadn't moved since takeoff. His stillness was both unnerving and captivating. The others on board seemed completely unaware of the tension she felt. Even though the man in 15 was now more than just an oddity to her, he had become an enigma, something she couldn't ignore. She found herself stealing glances at him whenever she could, but each time she did, he was always the same, calm, distant, and eerily composed. His gaze was often fixed out the window, but not in a way that suggested he was admiring the view. His eyes seemed to look past the clouds and into something far deeper, like he was searching for something or waiting for a signal that hadn't yet arrived. She couldn't help but wonder if he was aware of her watching him every time she looked his way. His face remained expressionless, as if he knew she was curious about him, but didn't care to reveal anything. He was like a stone, unmoving and unfeeling. And yet somehow he seemed to dominate the space around him. There was an air of control about him that made the flight attendant uneasy. No matter how many times she glanced at him, she could never read him. His features were sharp and precise, but his expression was always a mask carefully constructed to give nothing away. She noticed the notebook he had been flipping through earlier and couldn't help but wonder what it contained. Was it a journal with private thoughts? Was he studying something important? Or was he simply passing the time? The mystery of it all gnawed at her, and she couldn't push it aside any longer. Her curiosity grew to the point where she had to know more about him. And what was hiding behind that calm exterior? She had already checked his details once when she made her rounds asking for his ID, but it hadn't done anything to ease her suspicion. The passport he provided seemed legitimate, but it was the way he handed it over, the hesitation, the slight tension in his fingers, that made her question everything she had seen from him so far. She had already spoken to a few of the other passengers, and none of them had noticed anything unusual about him. No one seemed to pay him any attention, which only added to her growing sense that something was off. If he was just another businessman or a quiet traveler, why didn't he blend in like everyone else? Why did he feel like a shadow in the room? She found herself back at his seat. Once more, this time she made a point to stop in front of him, her eyes briefly flicking to his notebook before she looked back at his face. She wasn't sure what she expected, but his gaze met hers again, and there was something different in his eyes this time. Not the same blank indifference she had seen before, but something more guarded, as if he had just realized that she was getting too close to something important. She asked him again if he needed anything. His voice was quiet, but precise. As he declined with a polite smile, his eyes briefly flickered to the window again, and she noticed his fingers twitching slightly, almost as if he was reaching for something that wasn't there. The flight attendant stepped back, feeling a wave of unease wash over her. She wasn't sure why, but she had a sense that she had pushed too far this time. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head, that there was more to this man than she was equipped to handle. He wasn't just a strange passenger. He was something else, something that didn't fit with the rest of the world around him. She tried to focus on the rest of the cabin, but the sense of him lingered. It was like a shadow that followed her with every step she took. No matter how far she moved away, she could still feel his presence, pressing on her like a weight that wouldn't let go. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt a growing sense of danger, a sense that this wasn't just another flight. This wasn't just another day at work. Something was happening, something was unfolding right in front of her, and she couldn't look away. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, the flight attendant could feel a strange tension in the air that wasn't there before. It was as though something was shifting imperceptibly around her, like the calm before a storm. But the storm was still far off. She couldn't shake the sense that it was building just beneath the surface, and it had everything to do with the man in seat 15. As she had never felt so unsettled on a flight before. Usually she was able to gauge people, easily pick up on their moods or intentions. But this man was different. There was a coldness to him that made it impossible to predict his actions. She kept moving through the cabin, refilling drinks and checking on passengers. But every time she passed his seat, her eyes inevitably found him sitting perfectly still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze locked on the window once again. It was as if he was waiting for something. But what could it be? She had no idea. She watched him carefully, his expression still unreadable. But now there was something else. She noticed something subtle, a flicker in his eyes that wasn't there before. It was quick, but unmistakable. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. His gaze had shifted, and for the briefest of moments, he was staring directly at her. She froze in place, suddenly feeling as if she were the one being watched. For all the subtlety he had managed to hide up until now, his eyes betrayed him in that one moment. It was as if he was trying to communicate something without saying a word, and for just a second she felt an odd chill run down her spine. She quickly turned away, trying to shake off the strange sensation, but it lingered, and now she was more certain than ever that something was wrong. The flight attendant's instincts had always served her well, but this time they were screaming at her to be cautious. She had seen this behavior before in movies or stories, when a person was hiding something dangerous. But she didn't want to jump to conclusions. She had to remain professional. But it wasn't easy. She couldn't stop thinking about the notebook he had been flipping through earlier, the way his fingers twitched every time he reached for it, as if there was something important inside something he didn't want anyone else to see. She found herself walking past his seat again. This time her pace slowed as she tried to casually glance down at the notebook. Without drawing attention to herself, he had it open once more, and he was writing something now, his pen moving quickly across the pages. Her curiosity was piqued, but she couldn't afford to be too obvious about it. She moved past him and continued her duties, but her mind was fixated on the notebook, on what he could be writing on a long flight like this. Passengers often pass the time with books or movies, but this man, he was different. His focus was on something else, something that was consuming him. And the more she thought about it, the more her unease grew. She tried to distract herself by talking to other passengers, asking if they needed anything, but every time her eyes returned to his seat, he was there, still writing, still in his own world. She considered going to the cockpit to mention her suspicions to the captain, but she hesitated. She didn't have any solid proof, just a gut feeling that she couldn't ignore. She had no reason to believe he was a threat, but her instincts told her that something was off, something was building slowly but surely, and she didn't want to take the chance of ignoring it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she made her way to the galley, where she found a moment of quiet. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man. She couldn't understand why her mind kept circling around him every time she closed her eyes. She saw his face, his cold stare, his unnerving stillness. And it was all starting to feel too personal, like she was being pulled into something she didn't fully understand. But she couldn't walk away from it, not now, not when something felt so wrong. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she had the distinct feeling that whatever it was coming soon. As the minutes passed into hours, the flight attendant began to feel the weight of the tension pressing down on her. It was impossible to ignore the growing unease that lingered in the air like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. Every time she walked past his seat, she could feel his presence watching her with a quiet intensity. She wasn't sure what it was about him that unsettled her so much, but it was there like an invisible force, drawing her attention towards him. She had never been one to let her instincts cloud her professionalism, but now she couldn't deny that something was off with this man. She had spent years in the air and encountered all kinds of passengers, but never anyone like him. There was something about his silence, his stillness, that felt unnatural. There were moments when she'd glance at him only to catch him staring back at her with those cold eyes, and every time it sent a shiver down her spine. She decided to watch him more closely as the flight continued. In a subtle attempt to understand what he was hiding, she moved down the aisles quietly, checking on the passengers as usual, but she couldn't help but notice that the man in 15 was becoming even more withdrawn every time she looked at him. He was more distant, more detached. It was as if he was slowly retreating into himself, becoming less and less present in the moment. But the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just retreating from the world around him. It was as though he was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to act. But act on what she didn't know. She found herself walking past his row again. This time her eyes couldn't help but flicker down at his hands. They were gripping the notebook tightly, his knuckles white with tension. It was as if he was trying to hold something back. She watched him for a moment, wondering if he even noticed her approach. But his focus was entirely on the pages in front of him, his pen moving swiftly, as though he was writing something urgent, something important. She couldn't help herself. She leaned just a little closer, trying to catch a glimpse of what he was writing, but the pages were too far down for her to see. He seemed so engrossed in his task that he didn't notice her staring at him. The flight attendant moved away, quickly shaking off the feeling that she had overstepped her boundaries. But the curiosity was too strong to ignore. She had to know what he was writing. But how could she get close enough to see without arousing suspicion? The thought of asking him outright crossed her mind, but she quickly discarded it. It would seem too intrusive, and she wasn't sure she could trust her instincts enough to make such a bold move. But as the flight continued, she found herself back at his row again, her mind racing with questions. Was he some kind of criminal? Was he planning something dangerous? Or was it all in her head? All she had were these small clues: his odd behavior, his intense focus, his reluctance to speak to anyone else. She had already checked his ID once. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about it didn't add up. He'd have been too quick to hand it over, too eager to comply, and she had seen that hesitation in his eyes when he first presented it to her. Something wasn't right about the way he carried himself. It wasn't the quiet that made him strange, it was the weight of his silence, the sense that he was a man of secrets, hiding something beneath the surface. And the more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that he wasn't just another passenger traveling for business or leisure. No, there was something deeper, something more complicated than that. She began to move through the cabin again, but her eyes kept returning to him. As she passed his row, she could feel his gaze following her every time. It was almost like a game of cat and mouse, only she wasn't sure who was hunting who at this point. And just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, she felt a strange pull to approach him once more. Her heart was racing in her chest. As she walked towards his seat, her mind telling her to turn back, to keep walking. But she couldn't ignore the urgency that had been building in her all flight long. It was now or never. The moment had arrived. Her footsteps were steady, but her heart was pounding as she made her way down the aisle towards seat 15. The closer she got, the more her senses seemed to heighten every detail, felt amplified: the sound of her breath, the rustle of her uniform, the soft hum of the plane's engines. Even the small murmur of conversations around her seemed to fade into the background. Her focus narrowed down to one thing, and one thing only: the man in 15. As she reached his row and paused for just a moment, something in her gut told her to be cautious. But she couldn't stop herself from moving forward. She had to know what was going on. She had to know what he was hiding. Her eyes briefly flickered down to the notebook in his hands once more. But this time he didn't seem to notice her approach. His attention was fully absorbed by whatever he was writing, his pen moving quickly across the page, as though time was running out, and yet he remained utterly calm, his fingers never faltering in their movements. She leaned in slightly, hoping to catch a glimpse of what he was writing, but just as she did, he stopped, his pen hovering just above the page for a second, as though he had sensed her presence. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly stepped back, pretending to check on other passengers. But her mind was spinning with questions. What was he writing? Why was he so focused on it? And most importantly, why did it feel like there was a secret he was desperately trying to keep from her? She continued down the aisle, but now she was more aware of the way the other passengers were watching her. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, and it made her uncomfortable. She was a professional. She had been doing this job for years. But now it felt like she was out of her depth, like she was getting too close to something she wasn't meant to know. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to find out more. Every time she looked back at him, his eyes were on her, even if he wasn't physically looking. His presence felt like a shadow that followed her with every step she took. It was as if he knew what she was thinking, as if he could feel her every glance. He never said a word, but there was a strange connection between them, a silent exchange that made her question whether he was testing her, watching to see what she would do next. The thought unsettled her, but she couldn't stop herself from moving closer again. This time she had made up her mind. She was going to ask him outright what he was writing, and why he seemed so intent on keeping it secret. She couldn't hold back any longer. She stopped beside his seat and hesitated for a moment. Her heart was racing. Her palms were slightly sweaty, but she knew she couldn't back down now. She needed answers. The man's gaze flickered up to meet hers, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. It was an intense gaze, one that seemed to pierce right through her, as if he could see every thought in her mind. She took a deep breath and asked him softly if he needed anything, if there was anything she could do for him. He paused before replying. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he told her he was fine. But there was something in the way he said it that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them with such finality, as though he knew that she wouldn't push further, as though he had already seen through her, and knew exactly what she was thinking in that moment. She felt a chill creep up her spine, and she quickly turned away, but not before she noticed the faintest smile playing at the corners of his lips. It was small, but it was there, and it made her feel like she had just walked into a trap, one she hadn't seen. Coming the rest of the flight passed in a blur. She moved through the cabin, mechanically checking on the passengers. But her mind was no longer on her duties, it was on him, and the strange, unsettling feeling that he had just toyed. The hours dragged on as the flight continued its journey through the night, and the flight attendant found herself growing more and more restless every time she glanced at the man in seat 15. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and suspicions, but she couldn't make sense of any of it. The subtle smile he had given her earlier still lingered in her thoughts like a taunt, a silent challenge. She had no idea what he knew or how much he understood, but she was beginning to feel as if she was walking a thin line between curiosity and danger. Something was happening, something that didn't feel right, and yet she couldn't bring herself to walk away. She couldn't stop watching him, no matter how hard she tried. The cabin was quieter now, as many of the passengers had settled in for a nap or were lost in their own worlds, but the stillness in the air felt suffocating to her. It was as though the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The man in seat 15 hadn't moved in hours, not even to adjust his position, his hands still folded neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the window again. But this time there was something different in his posture, something subtle, but enough for her to notice he was tense. She could feel it, a kind of barely contained anticipation emanating from him. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment he had been waiting for. The flight attendant moved through the cabin, once more checking on the passengers, but her attention kept drifting back to him. Every time she passed by his row, she would glance over her shoulder just to make sure he was still there, still watching. But now it was different this time. When she looked back at him, he wasn't staring out the window anymore. His eyes were focused on something else, something that wasn't her, but still something that made her heart skip a beat. His gaze was intense, more focused than ever before, and for a moment she thought she saw something shift in him, as if something inside him had clicked into place, as though a decision had been made. She felt a sudden surge of unease and instinctively took a step back. But as she did, he looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers with a look that could only be described as knowing. It was as if he had been waiting for her to notice something, waiting for her to finally understand something that had been hidden just out of reach. She forced herself to smile and moved on, but her thoughts were racing. What was he waiting for? Why did he seem so sure of himself, so calm, as though he had orchestrated everything from the very beginning? She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all deliberate, that he had been toying with her every step of the way, testing her boundaries, seeing how far she would go to uncover the truth. She tried to push the thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back every time she walked past him, or caught a glimpse of his profile. Something inside her told her that she had crossed a line already. She had gotten too close to whatever he was hiding, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know more. She found herself walking toward the galley again. The air felt heavier here, somehow more oppressive, and her mind kept circling back to the man in 15. What was he doing? Why was he acting the way he was? She couldn't keep pretending it. was all coincidence. There was something bigger at play, something more dangerous. And she had a sinking feeling that the answer was on that notebook, the notebook he had clutched so tightly for hours. It had to mean something. It had to hold the key to whatever was happening. She had to find out. But how could she get close enough to see without him noticing? She had already pushed her luck with the brief moments of eye contact she had shared with him. But something in her gut told her it was now or never. She had to make her move. She couldn't let this go unanswered. So as the plane continued its flight, she steeled herself for what was coming. She didn't know what he would do or how he would react, but she knew one thing for sure: the moment she walked up to him again, things would never be the same. As the plane began its descent into the airport, the flight attendant felt an overwhelming sense of finality settle over her. She had watched the man in 15 for hours. Now her curiosity and suspicion pushing her forward, despite the growing unease gnawing at her gut. It was almost as if time had slowed for her in those final moments. Everything felt more intense. Every movement, every sound more amplified than ever before. The quiet hum of the engines, the murmur of conversations, the distant chime of the seatbelt sign, all seemed distant to her. As she walked the aisles one last time, she had made up her mind she would approach him again this time. There would be no turning back, no pretending that she wasn't aware that something was wrong. She couldn't keep pretending she wasn't part of this strange game. He was playing with her. She had to know what was going on. It felt like the plane itself was holding its breath in the final moments. Before landing, the flight attendant walked past him, once more her gaze flickering down at his seat. But this time something was different. She could feel the tension in the air shift. It was as though the game had reached its climax, and the final move was about to be made. The man in 15 was no longer just a mystery to her. He was a puzzle that had to be solved. His presence had become all-consuming. Her thoughts now only revolved around him. And the notebook he had kept so carefully guarded for the entire flight. Her heart raced as she paused just a few steps away from his row. She could see him once again staring out the window. But now his posture was different. It was no longer the calm stillness she had come to expect from him. There was a quiet intensity in the way he sat now, almost as if he was preparing for something or someone. She took a deep breath and finally stepped closer. Her footsteps, now the only sound in the cabin. As she stopped beside him, she couldn't bring herself to look at him right away. Instead, her eyes focused on the notebook in his hands. It was open again. But this time he was no longer writing. He was simply staring at the page with an intensity that mirrored the feeling building in her chest. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she watched him, waiting for him to make the first move, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he remained silent, his gaze never leaving the notebook. His fingers curled around it tightly, his knuckles white with the same tension she had noticed earlier. Finally, unable to resist any longer, she spoke softly, asking him if there was anything she could do for him. He didn't look up at first, but after a moment he lowered the notebook just enough to meet her eyes. The coldness in his gaze made her heart skip a beat, but he said nothing. His lips barely moved as he replied with a simple phrase that made her blood run cold. "I am exactly where I need to be in that moment." The flight attendant felt a wave of realization crash over her like a tidal wave. Everything she had felt during the flight, the unease, the strange connection, the unsettling silence, it all made sense now. This was no ordinary passenger. This wasn't a businessman or a quiet traveler. This was someone with a purpose, someone who had been on this flight for a reason, and she was part of whatever that reason was. But what was his true identity? What was he waiting for? As the plane touched down on the runway, she could feel the atmosphere shift once again. Something had changed in that last exchange. Something had clicked. And as the flight attendant made her way to the galley, her mind raced with questions. She didn't have the answers till she glanced back toward 15 one final time. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze was directed straight ahead, his hands still gripping the notebook tightly. It was then that she realized the truth. She'd have been so focused on his every movement that she hadn't noticed until now. He wasn't just holding the notebook. He was clutching it, as though it were the only thing that mattered. He wasn't just a man in a seat. He was a person with a mission. And now she was caught in it too. The plane had landed. But in that moment she understood that the journey wasn't over for her, not by a long shot.